Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, hello and welcome. Good to see everybody again. Hope you're having a good second day. I'm Melinda Crane, and it is my great pleasure to accompany you during this plenary session on enhancing transport system reliability and sustainability. You know, it hasn't been all that long since supply chain discussions here at the International Transport Forum summits were all about how to make those supply chains leaner, tighter, more efficient. That drive makes absolutely eminent sense in terms of cutting costs in the face of rising competition. But now companies are realizing that it may have traded higher efficiency for greater vulnerability. Supply chains with less slack and less redundancy are, in a word, less resilient. And that means greater risk. You hardly need me to remind you. From extreme weather events and natural disasters to cybercrime, piracy, and terrorism, external shocks are increasingly causing severe and wide-ranging disruption. And not only to supply chains, but to transport systems as a whole. For just as supply chains are stretched thinner than they used to be, transport networks for passengers are in many countries close to capacity, with complex interdependencies across various modes. So let me just start out by getting a brief show of hands. How many of you live in a city, a region, or a country where during the past year there has been some form of disruptive event that impeded transportation with adverse effects on either trade or tourism? How many people live in such a place? Okay, that looks like well over half. I'd say around 60% maybe. So clear proof, I think, that our topic does demand urgent attention. And that's what we're prepared to give it right now with a high-ranking panel of top policymakers and industry leaders. We'll be hearing from both sides about what they're doing to prepare for high-consequence threats, and threats that are both man-made and natural. We'll also take a closer look at planning tools and strategies at improving resilience, reliability, and, when needed, recovery. What kinds of collaboration and contingency planning do we need to put in place? And last, but certainly not least, given that resilience ought to begin with prevention, how far are we when it comes to reducing transport's contribution to the CO2 emissions that are causing climate change? Those are some of the questions that we want to address here on our panel, and we also look forward to discussing with you, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, later on in the discussion. It's my honor now to introduce our eminent panelists, beginning with Violeta Bulc. She was appointed European Commissioner for Mobility and Transport in 2014. She was previously Deputy Prime Minister in the government of Slovenia, and she also has extensive private sector experience as the former CEO of Vibacom Limited, Sustainable Strategies and Innovation Ecosystems. Great that you can be with us, Commissioner Bulc. Your place is in the middle. Thank you very much. And it is also my very great pleasure to introduce Andrés Gómez Lobo. He is Chile's Minister of Transportation and Communications, and we're especially grateful to him because he has agreed to join our panel at rather short notice. He's an economist with extensive academic experience in public policy, environment, and land use, and he has also served both as Chief Advisor to the Ministry of Transportation and as Director of the Santiago Metro System. Welcome to you, Minister. I'm also very pleased that David Scousel can be with us. He is President and CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council. He previously worked in private equity and venture capital, and he has extensive management experience in the travel industry, including as CEO of Apodo.com, a pan-European online travel company, which he built from the startup phase. A very warm welcome to you. With us also on this panel is Frank Brenner. He is Director General of Eurocontrol, an intergovernmental organization that's dedicated to the safety of air navigation in Europe with 41 member states. Previously, he served as General Manager of Operations for the functional airspace block that covers Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Frank Brenner, great that you can be with us. Chongmeng Tan is Group Chief Executive Officer of PSA International, one of the world's largest port operators. Before taking up that position in 2011, he had a 20-year management career with Royal Dutch Shell, which culminated in a post as Executive Vice President, Global Commercial Shell Downstream. He has also worn a policymaker's hat at the Singapore Ministry of National Development. Many thanks to you for being with us, Mr. Tan. And I'm pleased to introduce Peter Davey. He is CEO of Littleton Port of Christ Church in New Zealand. He joined the company in 2003, and he is now shepherding it through one of the most significant recovery projects ever undertaken in New Zealand, following the 2011 and 2012 earthquakes that damaged 75% of the port's wharves. He'll tell us shortly about his long-term vision for the reconstruction and enhancement of the port. Great to have you with us, Mr. Davey. And finally, a very warm welcome, please, for UNCTAD Deputy Secretary General Joachim Reiter. Prior to joining the organization just last month, Mr. Reiter was Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, heading its Department for International Trade Policy. He's also served as Sweden's ambassador to the World Trade Organization and as head of the trade section at its European Union office. So that is our very impressive panel. And we're going to begin with an input from Commissioner Bulc, and I'm just going to ask if you would perhaps address a question in your opening remarks. And that question has to do with the fact that we've heard a lot of resounding declarations here at the summit about the importance of trade and tourism for growth and for social inclusion. But clearly those benefits will only be realized if we have transport systems that are both reliable and resilient in the face of rising man-made and natural disasters. So the question for you is, what are the Commission's priorities to make our transport systems more resilient? You may go to the lectern, or you may speak from your seat, whichever you prefer.
Oh, you gave me
You have a choice, exactly.
Thank you very much. It's very comfortable here.
Okay, good. It's on. It's on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also for the question. It is, by all means, one of the hottest topics nowadays. More the globalization is taking over as the core orientation of all states and nations, more we are realizing how incredibly important transport is. And I'm sure that everybody in this room shares this understanding with me, and I'm now talking to those that are already believers, but the fact is that in maybe last 30, 40 days, years, especially in Europe, we neglected a little bit infrastructure, especially the transport infrastructure, and we're really seriously now trying to catch up. But let me also say something that really stuck in my mind yesterday when we had lunch with Director General of United Nations. My colleague, Commissioner for Development, said, if there is no models for resilience, there is no models for development. If there is no models for sustainability, there is no models for development. And if women are not included, there is no models for development either. So I think the message was very clear, and we need to pick up all three topics also very seriously in a sense of strategic development of transport. So we are also realizing that transport is all about people. Either people as passengers or people as businesses. And that's why we put the European Commission in the transport sector, we put people at the top. And we're, every time, whatever we now do, we ask ourselves who will benefit from this. So what will be really the consequence for either passengers or for businesses? And what is now the most effective approach to really manifest what we try to achieve? So it's not like overnight transition, but I think first very positive effects of that simple question are already seen. But let me just briefly answer your question directly. You ask, what are we doing in order to become more resilient, to be more sustainable? Of course, immediately the first thing that comes to my mind is how can we connect each other better? How can we cooperate better? How can we collaborate and co-create better? Because more we are connected, more we are free, more we are safe. Yeah? And this is really important that the transport understand that this is the role we are playing. We're bringing people together to connect people, to connect goods, to connect competences in order to address serious or less serious challenges that nowadays we have in our lives. And that's why on the level of EU, we put as a core philosophy and core vision that we have as a single European market. And transport, of course, plays an incredibly important role in that, and that's why it comes of no surprise that the core vision of transport sector is creation of a single European transport area. And that's why we're pushing on all modes now, all the necessary changes to actually manifest this single European transport area, to really create an economy of volume, an economy of scale that actually then bring the prices down, that increase competition, and that provides better services and create, of course, greater value, which is the absolute need for future development. And within that, we looked at, of course, at Europe as a whole, because that's what the fundamental reason for EU has always been. And in that core, we put the elements that drive this single market, single European transport area. That's why transport is so intensively involved in the European Energy Union, because we are, as I already mentioned today once, we use over 34% of all energy in Europe. So, of course, we need to be very conscious and very future-oriented, innovative in a sense of this energy consumption. And at the same time, we also then understand that we are one of the biggest generators of CO2 emissions, and we need to be very strong in innovation in a sense of decarbonization. And it will come of no surprise that we put decarbonization along with digitalization and internationalization as three core content drivers that we want to now include in every of our solutions, besides, of course, addressing the needs of people. The other one is, as I already briefly addressed, is digitalization, which also will contribute dramatically to resilience of European models, because for the first time, through digitalization of all transport modes, including maritime, aviation, road, railways, inland waterways, we bring on board SMEs. So far, SMEs had a very small role to play in overall transport market. But with digitalization, we are opening a completely new field for value-added services, value-added solutions, where SMEs can really play an important role. And through that, of course, new job opportunities, employment opportunities. And as we know, Europe is over 95% of SMEs. So this is just yet another important move that we hope is going to contribute to the resilience and sustainability. But I don't want to be too long, but let me just briefly bring on board some really concrete strategies and actions that are going on right now, besides these two horizontal projects on Energy Union and Digital Single Market. One is, for sure, REFIT project, which also contributes to resilience, which we are now in a very strong process of refitting all our regulatory frameworks, including transport. And this year, our stress is on aviation. So aviation package that we are getting ready for, and hopefully it will be approved by the end of the year, has two important pillars. One is the aviation strategy. The other one is really the revisioning of all IASA regulations. And that it's a very concrete contribution. The other one that we are getting ready for, it's a road package. We're opening up a public consultation in July, and it's coming in 2016, which will also bring on board very seriously social issues, and besides social issues, also market opening and digitalization. Again, all three elements important for sustainability and resilience. The next one we will follow, it's a maritime and inland waterways in 2017. So these are the core elements, but besides that, one is, for me, one of the most exciting and the most responsive one from the field is also the smart cities, or communities of the future, as we call it now, where smart cities play an important role. And we've heard already today, cities represent over 80% of all population and revenue generation, and we need to really pay special attention to them, and this is where resilience has real roots. We were now asked by mayors, by member states, to address cities in a more comprehensive way, even though that's a level of member states. But what we're doing is building platforms where they can exchange good practices, where we are issuing different rewards to encourage good practices, and that they get also attention. But we see that this is a really progressive thinking available already, and there's a very high concentration of brain power and emotional capital in the cities. So I'm pretty sure that transport, and especially the mobility related issues and this last loop logistics services and similar things will play a very important role in the overall model of transport as well. So this is really brief. So if I want to say it in 3 words, digitalization, decarbonization, internationalization, and of course humanization of transport are those big things that I believe are direct contribution to the topic today. And I hope that with all of collaboration with all of you, we will make it and we will create the world we want. And transport will certainly play an important role in that. Thank you very much.
Commissioner, thank you very much. And I'll add 2 more words to your list, which in effect sum up perhaps the others, namely cooperation and connectivity, both in the sense of cooperation and collaboration among different actors, different stakeholders, both public and private sector, and then connectivity both in the sense of digitalization, but also improving the links that can help ensure resilience. And we'll pick up on both of those themes now in our discussion. You will have noted from the introductions, ladies and gentlemen, that we've got a wealth of expertise here, some of it more focused in the passenger, tourism, and aviation area, and some of it more focused in the maritime and freight and trade area, and then a couple of bridging actors here on the panel as well, including the next person I would like to ask to address us, namely Minister Gomez. His country has experienced no less than 3 major disruptions just in the past year. I think you said it was. So I think we'd be very, very interested in hearing about your experience in both sectors, essentially. I know that there have been a number of recent flight disruptions due to the volcano Kabuko that has been exploding, but of course you've also had very severe disruptions in other areas as well. So perhaps you can tell us something about your experiences there and what lessons you've learned.
Hello. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much. I was asked yesterday if I could participate in this panel, and I immediately accepted because I come from a country that's very prone to natural disasters, not unlike New Zealand also and some other countries. And since I took office over 14 months ago, as you just mentioned, we've had 3 major natural disasters that have interrupted telecommunications and transport networks. I also have the privilege to be the only one that was allowed to present some pictures, so I just wanted quickly to go through the events. In April last year, less than a month since I assumed office, we had an 8.3 earthquake in the north of Chile. Just to put this in perspective, the recent earthquake in Nepal was 7.8. Although earthquakes aren't comparable just by that number, but this was quite a strong one. And it affected the port infrastructure, and also, and what I wanted to show in this picture, is that road, which is the only road that connects the city down below with the city on top. The only other road is 80 kilometers longer, so you have to go around for 80 kilometers. So I'll talk about that later. That's the road from Iquique to Alto Hospicio, which was damaged by the earthquake. So it's a very weak link. Then in April this year, we had the Calbuco volcano, which you might have heard about because of the beautiful pictures that were taken. And that also created disruptions in mainly in land transport and air transport, as some of the panelists will probably mention later the issue. And then also earlier this year, we had the floods in Atacama, which is a desert where it rains once every 80 years, and it just happened to rain as I was minister, so we had another emergency. This was the deadliest one, with 26 people killed, and we have 120 people missing. When it rains in the desert, hell breaks loose because there's no vegetation. The mudslides are very impressive, and the cities were under a meter of mud. So I just wanted to show those pictures to motivate everyone and tell you about our experience and the challenges we faced and what lessons we can get from all this, particularly for transport and telecommunication, although I have to say telecommunications was a bit more complex. And I just want to touch on 3 points. One is connectivity and infrastructure. 2 are relief operations. What does transport have to do for relief operations? And then the importance of transport and particularly logistics to reestablish normality. After a major emergency, it's very important to bring things back to normal. People, stress level goes down when you bring things back to normal. And their transit services, interurban transport, and particularly logistics and having food in the supermarket allows you to bring back a certain normality, which is very important to get people back to normal and lower their stress rate. In connectivity, I guess the important point here is that you have to, earlier you have to find what the weak points are. You might know Chile is a very long country, and we only have one north-south highway. So we're very prone, it's very vulnerable, any of these events. If you cut the highway, the only way to get to another part of the country is either through water, through the shipping, air, or through Argentina. And so we are vulnerable. We have a vulnerability there. Not like I was speaking yesterday to the Minister of Transport from Denmark, and he said that they had a similar vulnerability in the bridges they have in the main islands. If one of the bridges is damaged, they're going to have big problems. So these vulnerability points are very important to identify them beforehand. In the case of Iquique and Alto Hospicio, what I wanted to note there is that one of the major vulnerability was that that road was damaged, and you had these 2 cities isolated. And that created many problems. One of them, for example, unexpected, is that most of the transit drivers live up in the hill in the city on top. So if you want to bring things to normality, you had no way to kickstart the transit system because the drivers were isolated in the city in the mountain. So redundancy is a big issue there. What can you do to get redundancy? What we're doing in the case of this city is we're building a cable car, which has been a very successful solution in many transit experiences in Latin America, mainly Medellin and Rio de Janeiro, in La Paz. When you have big height differences, as a transit option, cable cars are quite competitive. So we have a project underway to build a cable car. But there are also other things, for example, redundancy in ports. We have another city in Chile called Antofagasta, where we have a port in the city, but then we have another bay in the north with another port. And it's very important to keep them both working, because if you get a tsunami, you'll either get it straight from the sea to the city or in the bay in the north, but not both. So there's an issue of maintaining both ports active as an insurance policy in case we get a tsunami in one of the 2 areas. But the challenge is, how much are you willing to pay for redundancy? How do you incorporate redundancy in a cost-benefit analysis, for example? How do you justify building another highway for an event that's going to occur once every 20 years or 30 years? And I think that's a big issue we should talk about. The other is naturally to have contingency plans. As for the second point, relief operations, just two very brief points. Importance of management, having contingency for management plans. For example, fuel rationing. whenever you have one of these emergencies, it's very important to introduce fuel rationing immediately for emergency vehicle and transit and public transport services. So that's one of the lessons we learned. The other thing is that we have a big program I'm going to be speaking about tomorrow of subsidizing transport services for isolated areas, mainly bus services for isolated localities. We tendered subsidies to have connectivity for those areas where people are poor and they don't have cars. But in the contracts for those subsidies, we introduced the clause that in the case of an emergency, those vehicles have to be put to the authorities for evacuation for whatever need the authorities need them. So this was very useful in the case of the Calvuco volcano to have these buses and also subsidized rural school transport available to the authorities for evacuation purposes. And finally, to reestablish normality, which I said is a big, important point that unless you get involved with these emergencies, you don't realize it, the importance it has until you've lived through it. And there, for example, just two examples, in the Atacama and the flooding region, we declared certain roads exclusive for public transport. And that way, public transport had an advantage, and it created jobs for the transit industry and also brought the city back to normal. Also very important, logistics. You have to have contingency plans. It's very important, particularly in isolated areas like in the north of Chile that is very desertic, and therefore it's not self-sufficient. If you don't get trucks through in 3 days, supermarkets will get out of stock, you won't have fuel, so you have to have contingency plans and be very quick to regain connectivity in order to allow logistic chain to be brought into work again. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Many thanks to you. And again, we'll be picking up on a number of those themes, questions of redundancy and how we pay for them, dual use potential in conjunction with contingency planning, identification of vulnerabilities and dependencies. Those are all themes that I heard you emphasize there. So I think we're going to come back to some of those a bit later when we also focus once again on maritime trade. Let's now talk a bit, though, about the passenger perspective and aviation. And I'm going to start out by asking Mr. Scousel to tell us a bit about what travel business operators are looking for from regulators in terms of ensuring that transport systems are as resilient as possible. What would be your priorities? And do you have a mic? You do not.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Let me just sketch out where the travel industry is at a very top level in terms of data. And the reason I do that is to take a very quick look back in the past and then look forward in the future and then get to this issue of this industry being very resilient. Now, we account globally for about 10% of GDP, around $7 trillion. We employ about 277 million people. And going forwards, we look at that growing around 4% for the next 10 years, about 1% faster than GDP. And we'll add another 80 million jobs into the market, approximately. If you look back over time in our industry, with the exception of 1991, the Gulf War and the recession that followed that, and 9/11, when the whole world stopped traveling, and we were definitely not resilient for a period of 6 to 9 months, the industry's just grown steadily for 25, 30 years at around 4%. Now, as we look around the world globally, we are becoming much more susceptible to incidents, whether they're natural disasters, man-made terrorist attacks. There are lots of regional conflicts burgeoning around. But at a very macro level, the industry is extraordinarily resilient. And any incident in a particular part of the world does not have a total impact on the way the industry evolves and develops. When we look specifically at this issue of resilience and different types of disasters, and we track the recovery cycles, it ranges anything between 8 months and maybe 26 months, depending on the type of incident and how fast the government reacts to restore normality post that incident. So with a natural disaster, the countries that work very fast, just the way the minister was describing, to get to that recovery position quickly, and then to go out and market the country again, to say the country's open for business again, both for domestic and international tourism, those are the countries that recover very, very fast. And if I take an example of Japan that suffered this terrible tsunami, earthquake, and flooding, we tracked very carefully the recovery of Japan because everything stopped dead. Nobody wanted to go there. And the Japanese themselves stopped traveling for probably 8 weeks out of respect for those that were killed, apart from anything. But very quickly, when the government attacked the problem fast with the private sector, it recovered. And within 9 to 12 months, it was back where it was before the incident. So I think the message, just to open up in terms of my comments, is that we are fortunate to operate in an extraordinary resilient industry. We are inevitably going to continue to have disruption all of the time, and hopefully it's localized disruption to a city or an airport or something that's happening in a particular country. So at a macro level, it doesn't have an impact. But of course, where we need to react very fast, both public and private sector working together, is to plan for, put the resilience in the system, and then when these tragedies strike, whatever they are, move very fast to get back to normality over a period of months, not years.
You're emphasizing speed, but between the lines, it seems to me that you're also telling us we've got important communication and confidence issues to be addressed in the face of a disaster.
Yes, I mean, whatever type of disaster it is, it's clearly a shock to people that are traveling on business or leisure, and it can be disruptive because you cannot move from A to B. The volcanic ash cloud that hit Europe, similar to other parts of the world, was quite extraordinary because it stopped everybody in the city they were for a period of 3 or 4 weeks. Nobody could move anywhere. And that's where you really see the impact. And typically in our meetings with presidents and prime ministers, they tend not to know too much about our industry, and they tend to ignore our industry because it kind of happens until there's a major impact or disaster. And then, of course, they'll wake up because the restaurants are empty and the hotels are empty. But it is a very resilient industry.
Many thanks. Let me now come to Frank Brenner, staying with the question of aviation. And I know that at Eurocontrol, you have initiated the development of a vision and a strategy which are intended to increase safety and resilience. So do tell us something about that, if you would. But I'd also be curious to know whether systems intended to improve safety and resilience automatically mean that we've got to put up with some trade-offs in terms of efficiency and timeliness. Certainly in the case of air traffic in Europe, there is a great deal of congestion already. Many systems are stretched to capacity, and in that sense, must we automatically then expect that there will be trade-offs?
The situation in Europe is that we are a continent that is relatively small with a high fragmentation, 41 states in Europe, and it has a high density of air traffic. So it's clear whenever there are any kind of impacts to the air traffic system, it hits the passengers, it hits the overall European aviation significantly. The outbreak of Eyjafjallajökull 2010 was mentioned.
Iceland.
In Iceland, it was an outbreak of a volcano that was not at all on our radar screen that it could happen and impact Europe to that extent. In other words, Europe was not at all prepared for anything like that, and the consequences were disastrous. We were calculating the volcano ash all over Europe with mathematical models, but didn't have the equipment to measure the concrete ash volume in the air, and only later on found out that we had blocked the whole air traffic for days without any real reason. So we learned out of that. We have now been nominated as Eurocontrol by the European Commission to act as network manager in order not only to have all the data that are necessary for air traffic in one hand and operate with them, but also have a communication line to all the airports of the 41 member states, all the air navigation service providers, the airspace users, not to forget the military, in order to immediately go to action when something happens in that network. Now, a network of that size, every day something happens in such a network. Hopefully the consequences are not as disastrous as we just explained. Yesterday, you might have seen in the news, we had some break of the electricity in Brussels. So these are impacts to that network, and our job is to minimize the effect for the passengers in that respect in order to make the connectivity still possible and let them fly. Now, on the climate issue and the capacity issue, we have done a number of studies. How does the climate change in Europe? And we see that with the years to come, the climate will get rougher, stormier, windier, and that, of course, has impact to our network. If you operate at capacity limits, of course, any kind of rough weather immediately distorts your network operation because the capacity goes down, the connectivity cannot be assured anymore. So that's something we need to take into consideration for the future and for the planning. We are measuring the performance of the network. The European Union has set up a target of delays, maximum allowed per flight. That is 30 seconds per flight to be delayed, and that is measured for each and every flight, for each and every day around the clock for the whole year. We didn't meet that target in the last year. We were with 0.6 minutes, and of course also all weather impacts, which are really difficult to manage, but also all union impact go into that calculation and are also calculated second by second for each flight. So the basis of discussions and the figures are all there. The targets help us to drive for more efficiency, connectivity, new ideas in order to make the network work and function even if there are these kind of impacts. On the question of capacity in the future, yes, there I see literally dark clouds, especially when we talk about the hub airports. Airports like London Heathrow operate today at the maximum of what they can operate, and if there are impacts like weather or any other kind of impacts of technical failures, immediately the connectivity of such a hub is not certain anymore. We are still living in Europe in a growing business in aviation. That is very good, that's helpful, but that also means we need to look at our infrastructure. At the moment, looking at the airport expansion plans in Europe, we will see missing capacity in 2035 of significant volume. Our calculation is that at the moment for the big hubs, as there are no construction plans really ongoing, and it's not easy to convince population that one needs to expand airport infrastructure, I'm completely aware of that, but we will face a capacity crunch of about 1.9 million flights in 2035 not being served due to non-availability of capacity at the hubs. And that is something which we encourage to discuss in Europe. It is something which we need to see happening because it will have a significant impact on the GDP and of course also on our competitiveness compared to the rest of the world if we cannot cater these kind of needs. And we all know airport infrastructures are not built overnight, so it's a quite huge and long-term planning process needed, and that's something which needs to be taken on board, because if you operate not only one London Heathrow type airport in Europe, but 15 of them, which is our calculation, of course the kind of vulnerability is a much higher percentage than just with one operating at capacity limits.
So you are confident that if we were to have an ice cloud again, we would be much better equipped to deal with it?
Well, we definitely then would see that the tourists would go to other destinations than they currently go if the weather changes. We also calculated what it means if we have suddenly a change in temperatures over the next 20 years to come. Will the tourists still go where they currently go? Will they go to complete different destinations in order to see the sun but not be burned immediately? So these are impacts that are definitely impacting the network, the main traffic flows, and also the need for ground investment of the airports and air navigation service providers. So that's really being taken into consideration.
One other very brief backup question. The Commissioner mentioned the importance of trying to better integrate markets, and certainly that has been an EU aspiration to try to integrate the main air traffic management zones into a larger unit. But as you know, air traffic manager unions have not exactly embraced it, and in fact, the plan has been in the works for a decade now. Don't we badly need to really make this happen if we want to relieve congestion and also do something about reducing CO2 emissions in this sector?
I personally believe that cooperation across national borders is absolutely important. We cannot have stovepipe pillar structures in 41 countries and think we do the most efficient business and way of business. We are encouraging now with the huge investment plan which is supported by the European Commission of more than 3 billion of new ATM infrastructure, not to only look at investments on local level but also look at possible investments on a regional level where service providers provide a service commonly, and of course also on a central level, because one doesn't need to have all ATM services and infrastructures rebuilt 41 times. A lot of them are very sufficiently being for the public use if they are provided once or twice in Europe with a backup system in place, and one doesn't need 41 times the same service.
Thank you very much. One brief question before we leave the area of aviation, and it relates to the fact that, of course, resilience needs to begin with prevention, namely with real moves to reduce CO2 emissions in the sector. You mentioned, Commissioner Bulc's initiatives to decarbonize aviation. Now, one of the things that the Commission tried to do was get into place a real carbon emission trading system that was not particularly well received. What other initiatives can we look at to decarbonize aviation?
Well, of course, you mentioned one, which is, and it's been a discussion, it's agreement on a global scale. We have International Organization for Aviation, within which, ICAO, within which we need to reach an agreement how we're going to address this globally. So I'm expecting with the new Secretary Director General of ICAO organization that we will move forward on this issue, and Europe is certainly encouraging bold steps in this direction. But here I have to say I'm very encouraged by the technology as well. Technology can serve us really well in reaching more ambitious goals, and the latest moves that are going towards new technologies regarding the storage of electrical energy, and also new batteries and new propulsion systems are showing us a way that there is possibility that we introduce new type of propulsion systems in aviation as well, maybe talking even about hybrid solutions for airplanes, but of course we need to have a very concrete discussion with the industry how fast they can follow this kind of ambitions in the manifestation. On the other hand, as you already briefly mentioned, and it was discussed, is European Commission put forward a very ambitious plan under the umbrella of so-called CES2+ initiative for better management of aviation slots and better management of aviation space that already my colleague mentioned briefly as well. But here we are facing a bit of also consciousness level. I mean, it is something to propose that is really good for the single European market, but the member states have to catch up with this kind of open-minded perspective, because there are issues that they need to deal with on a member states level, and the issues of people's lives, people's careers, and we always try to find a balance how to address both and still move forward. I'm kind of hopeful that even by the end of this year we will make some progress in this topic as part of the also aviation package that I mentioned before, but it's absolutely necessary that we address these issues in a more open-minded, connected, single space manner. After all, we all share one single planet and one single space. Maybe we will talk about connectivity later, but I'd just like to, I'd like to just bring one attention to it, how extremely important it is that we never talk about only one mode. because the resilience and sustainability is about really co-moduality. So how can we bring all modes on board with a good cooperation? And this is what Europe is now going after. We're trying to bring all modes on the equal level in a sense of competitiveness and a shape, good competitive shape, that they can contribute equally. And this is something it's worth talking about later on.
Absolutely. We're coming right back to that, but just one last word on this question, perhaps, of decarbonization in aviation. Consciousness change, David Scalzo. Let's say we could actually finally get either a viable carbon emission trading system and or a jet fuel tax. Would travel operators and travelers truly be willing to pay higher costs for more sustainable air transport?
I don't think so, is the short answer to the question. The Commissioner was talking about the process that ICAO has kicked off now, which was effectively triggered by Europe doing something which got a reaction in China and the US around the taxation issue. And so ICAO absolutely has to put something in place globally to fix this. If you come to the airlines themselves, the operating airlines with IATA have got very, very strict targets in for carbon emissions reduction over time, and it's driven by everything from new aircraft to different approaches through ATC systems and better engine technology, all of those good things. But when you stand back and look at this, aviation is about 2% of the carbon emissions globally. And what we've not been very good at as an industry is communicating to the consumer, to the man and woman on the street, that the industry is actually working pretty hard on its 2%, but there's a whole bunch of other things going on over here which are actually volumetrically much more important. But to the specific question you ask, we see this a lot in the hotel industry, where a lot of hotels are becoming very environmentally friendly, and because typically it increases the running costs of a hotel, putting in lots of equipment to do all these things in a better way, they want to create a higher price structure. And when it comes down to people choosing a vacation and looking at prices and looking on TripAdvisor for reviews, they're more likely to make their ultimate decision based on those factors, rather than saying, well, actually, I'm prepared to pay another 15 or 20% to the airlines and hotels because I feel strongly about this issue. So the answer to your question is no, not yet.
Okay, Mr. Tan, you also had a comment.
No, I had a question actually. I hear a lot about the role of infrastructure in promoting resilience in the aviation industry and then convergence across the various air hubs. But I didn't hear about the airlines. Now, they're also consolidating. They're also upgrading the fleet systems. What are the things that are happening in the airline industry that have an effect on resilience, and whether operating in merged entities or in alliance mode has an effect? Because in the shipping industry, it has a tremendous effect, and I wonder whether it is similar in the airline industry.
I think that question would go to David Scalzo.
Well, let me start, and then probably Frank could chip in. The alliances in the airline industry have not gone as far as they could do to increase the robustness and resilience of the industry. So, for example, every airline inside an alliance or inside a joint venture still operates its own airline operating certificate from that country, has its own pilots, its own techniques. There's no interoperability of aircraft fleets. And there's not likely to be any time in the future, because these alliances were created 20 years ago based on passenger benefits, frequent flyer programs, sitting in each other's lounges, connectivity and pricing and all of those good things. But to get to a level where you had one IT system for an alliance group of airlines and a completely interoperable fleet with simplistic branding XYZ airlines instead of individual airlines, that's very difficult to see, because it goes right back to the roots of the Chicago Convention and airline ownership and bilateral agreements, which stops this industry developing the way that car manufacturing or chemicals manufacturing could, by moving things around the world. But Frank may have more comment on that.
Briefly, if you would.
Well, I think the Europeans, with the creation of a single aviation market, have seen much more flexibility than going from country to country in bilaterals. So since we have that single aviation market and any airline out of the EU can fly on any route within the EU they want and also swap quite quickly, I think the alliance systems have an impact, but not to that impact than perhaps in other parts of the world where that single aviation market is not created. For the infrastructure part, of course, I'm advocating that the part we have created in Europe for the airborne side with an aviation market and competition beyond, we could also look at, isn't that a way for look on the ground infrastructure and the move also for an aviation ATM market on the ground?
Thank you very much. A very interesting question, Mr. Tan. And we will now, however, leave aviation behind us, I think, and move to the ground and perhaps to the shifting ground in New Zealand. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Davey, to tell us a bit about what you experienced in terms of crisis response in the port and also your priorities in terms of building longer-term recovery, because as we mentioned, it is one of the biggest recovery efforts that has ever been undertaken in New Zealand.
Thank you. I listened to David and he started with the overview. I want to start with the underview and kind of look at it from a people perspective, because for those of us who've been through a natural disaster, and I was unlucky enough to do it, it's a deeply personal kind of thing that you go through, and it's quite revealing to the person. And I just want to touch on that for a second before I type a move into a couple of the rebuild issues. Firstly, to say, I think you've all dined very well over the last few days, and I'm sure you've sat down at dinner and enjoyed it. We were sitting down having a lunch with Trans-Pacific partners from the United States, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and hell breaks loose. And chandeliers come from the roof, people are diving under tables, chimneys fall into the room, and you literally walk outside to see collapsed buildings to which you know, in this case, in one case, over 100 people were working and were all killed. So it becomes one of then saying, how do you connect with your world? And from my perspective, very simple. I had a wife, I didn't know where she was. Well, I still have a wife, actually. And 3 children. And you're trying to find those children and know where they are, knowing that you have no communications. Most of your roading network is out, and you're trying to move around and do what is fundamental to most of us, which is our families. Now, about this time when I talk about this, people kind of go, oh, it'll never happen to me. There'll be no disaster in my life, I'll be lucky, etc., etc. So I throw out a challenge and I say to the woman in the room, by the time you're 80, how many will have a heart attack? And the men, by the time you're 70, how many will have a heart attack? The statistic is 50%. So how many are doing anything about that? So don't think that disasters happen to other people, they happen to you as well. So we go on then and say, we've got an immediate disaster, how do we get out of that position? The first thing is actually before the disaster, and it's knowing what you've got. In our case, we had simulated earthquakes. And then when we have the earthquake, we know what it's done to our buildings, what it's done to our wharves, and what resilience we have left and how we can operate. To the extent I was able to talk to our Prime Minister within a day and say, look, in 96 hours we'll have the port functioning and you can get through the things you need. And the things you need in a disaster are quite simple: food and water, and fuel comes next. Once you've got those things in place, you can start thinking about the next stage, which is immediate recovery and long-term recovery. So long-term recovery, that's a long-term build. But what we do need to know is what our next disaster may look like so we can build for it. I think that'll cover it for now.
Thank you very much. And of course, recapping things that we've heard both from the Minister and from others in terms of speed, in terms of identifying vulnerabilities and weak links. So we'll be picking up on all of that. Let me now, however, ask Mr. Tan to talk a bit about where you see the main threats to reliability and resilience when you look at the ports that you are operating. And of course, they are in a region that has seen some major natural disasters in recent years, and certainly also a region that is extremely important for international trade.
Well, ports are used for trade. If something happens in the airline industry, it affects people immediately, and that certainly isn't acceptable. But in the trade industry, you can wait a day or two. So actually, the natural disasters tend to affect one port or in an isolated region, and you can, unlike what Peter, right, has just said, if it affects a large area, you have to have a very systematic response. But in most cases, if it is a typhoon, it passes, and so on and so forth. So natural disasters are not really the biggest threat by and large. In fact, I want to talk about the threat that we are to ourselves. Some of the challenges that we have in the port industry is actually man-made. Now, just a bit about PSA, 43 years old company, one of the largest port operators in the world, 40 terminals, one of which is Singapore, the largest transshipment hub in the world. Volume that is handled last year is roughly about Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Hamburg combined. So it is quite a challenge. We worry about it. Resilience is very important. Now, what has happened is that in the last 2.5 decades, container handling volume has grown exponentially, about 7 times. And in order to cope with that, and during that time also as oil price has risen, shipping lines have changed also quite substantially the size of their ships. And it's gone from 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16 now, average, within about the same period. So every 8 years, there's been a doubling in the size of ships. But ports are built for about 30 years, so there is a timing difference between the decisions on the line side and the rest of the infrastructure. Now, for trade supply chain, there are basically 4 segments that we need to be concerned about. And shipping line is only one of them. They interface with ports, ports interface with landside infrastructure, and landside infrastructure is mobilized by freight forwarding equipment. So these are the 4 components. But let me give you another statistic. The top 20 shipping lines today possess about 90% of the shipping fleet, container shipping fleet in the world. So to change the container fleet, it takes 20 CEOs and their boards to make a decision. Okay. But there are hundreds of ports, thousands of landside infrastructure stakeholders, and even larger numbers of freight forwarding companies, and convincing people that they've got to change, even adopting smart technology. So there is a challenge when you talk about trying to mobilize change as a whole in such a landscape that I've just described. So what's happened in the last few years is that we saw the advent of the first, what I call the mega ships, 18,000, the EEE, Maersk, 2013, and then by 2018, we will have about 80 of those very big ones. And if I consider 10,000 TEUs and above, large enough to worry most ports, we will have about 400 of them. Now, because they are harder to fill, and actually this is something I must say that the world needs as a solution in the future. So I'm in no way standing in the way of megaships. However, we need to be able to cope with them and actually ensure that we are not breaking down the resilience of the rest of the trade system. Because what we saw last year when we first came out was really congestion, confusion, and an inability to operate in a smooth and seamless manner. The plus of all this is actually that the energy intensity per container movement has come down significantly. So the world has been helped by this. And in fact, in the whole trade carbon emissions from end to end, if you like, the marine side is the biggest contributor, and then after that, the trucks and the rail. So it's a good thing that they're able to address it and cheapen, have less impact on the environment, reduce their costs and less impact, more sustainable. However, these larger ships are harder to fill, so they have alliances. And with alliances come complexity, hence my question. The difference between customers in an airline hub or airport and containers is that the customers will find their way, so you don't have that complexity, and containers need to be moved. And so as a result, the complexity started to impact hub ports, small ports as well. And one thing I observed last year in so many years in this industry is that previously, when certain ports were congested, the effects were isolated. It was contained in the port or the downstream ports. But last year, when there was congestion, it affected much more. It became a contagion. Whether it's a Pacific side or whether it's in Europe, we found that there were many instances where there were ripple effects. Going forward, I think we have to address this, not by denying big ships, but questioning whether, firstly, the number of big ships should just be allowed to freely increase, or whether there should be a more concerted effort to moderate that, number one. But number two, I think more importantly, that we as a whole industry have to begin to address the other components of the trade chain that inevitably have to be dealt with. And I'll just close by suggesting 3 areas which I think as policymakers and people in the industry, we can work together to try to address this. As an owner of ports, I know that some of our ports will never make it into the future. We look to the agreement of governments to either allow us to consolidate, to make them bigger, or to close them and to move to a better place. As a policymaker, you want to ask yourself whether you have examined all the ports under your purview, that they are actually robust and competitive for the next 10 to 20 years, imagining the shipping fleet of the future. The second area is also a hardware-related area, which is the port-related infrastructure. I like the report by OECD as published last year on global port city competitiveness, which traced back the history of how trade promoted cities, and hence port was associated with cities. But over time, because GDP has become more diversified, ports move away from cities, but not necessarily with the appropriate transport, freight corridor, and an inadequate, and I think a missed opportunity to go with a higher reliance of rail, because rail is, of course, cheaper in the longer run. So the question, I think, to ask ourselves is, does each of us have a port and city urban plan, master plan, that is good enough for the next 20 years? Because as I say, it takes about 5 to 8 years to upsize ships, double, but it takes cities a decade, 2 decades, sometimes longer. I just came from Panama, and this is the first upgrading in 100 years. And it takes a lot longer when it comes to dealing with hinterland issues. And then the third aspect, I would say, is on the software side, and if you don't have it, it's a missed opportunity, is a port community system. The number of stakeholders that operate around logistics related to a port are so large, customs, freight forwarders, and government agencies, licensing, documentation, all that one should seriously ask ourselves that if we don't have a good port community system in our port, what are we waiting for? The technology is there, it can be done. It tends to be resisted by people who want to protect their jobs. But if you have trucks lining up, waiting to get into a port, right, chances are you don't have a good port community system. Because in the ports where they are, the trucks are told when to arrive, they arrive on time, and they get in and they get out without disturbing the rest of the community. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And that was a very intensively content-driven answer. But if I try to pick out some key messages where I do see a link with our aviation discussion, it would certainly be, among other things, that if we want to promote greater sustainability and resilience, regardless of the nature of the risk or the threat, because of course you were talking about, as you said, one that we have created for ourselves, we must look at the systems as a whole, and we must promote cooperation, as the Commissioner mentioned, or integration of all the different actors in that system in order to make sure that we're not trading off sustainability for efficiency. And in that sense, holistic approach. Let me now come to Joachim Reiter and ask you to comment perhaps also on the supply chain resilience issue and where you see the need to make changes in order to promote that, and then also perhaps to address some of the issues that we have just heard in terms of adaptation going forward.
Thank you very much, and I really liked the challenge by Mr. Tan, which was do we plan good enough for 20 years? And I think the organization I come from, we start from a development perspective. That leads us automatically to a trade perspective, since trade to some extent is the blood that provides the oxygen and nutrition to economies so that they can develop. Now, the reason why my organization is also involved in transport is, of course, that the transport sector is the arteries and the veins, if you want, that allows the blood to flow. So for us, it's a very natural link. And I will try to tackle your question by building quite a bit on Mr. Tan, because I think this was very useful. The way we see it from a point of view of a development perspective, and we really do consider that there needs to be a global perspective, particularly if you look at the freight transport sector and the connectivity there. Basically, more and more the story of developing countries is the manner in which you need to grow and lift your population out of poverty is by linking up to global value chains. By linking up to global value chains, automatically you then put a lot of pressure on your transport network, because that has to work. If you clog, you're out. Or as you say in traffic when you drive, you snooze, you lose. That's you in Belgium where I learned how to drive. So this is basically a question of, in order to make sure that we reach all the objectives that we set for ourselves as a global community, that involves finance ministers that are going to Addis this summer, it will involve prime ministers that will meet in New York, they're going to have to care about transport sector. And I think this is one of the missing pieces in the puzzle, that this tends to be a rather sectoral discussion rather than seeing it as a sort of whole of the economy perspective and from a global perspective. So where we stand, that's certainly our view on the issue. My second point is this issue of the sustainability versus, if I can put it like, resilience. We really don't see a contradiction between the two. In other words, for a system to be sustainable, it has to be resilient, but also, and in order to be resilient, it has to be sustainable. One of the things that we have looked to, and that really goes to Mr. Tan's question, is actually climate change, not from the point of view of the carbon footprint of this sector, but actually from the point of view that the total climate changes that we are going through, how will this affect this sector? To what extent is this sector prepared for climate change? And that's, I must say, is an area where a little bit too little attention has been given, particularly by non-transport people, meaning finance ministries that are going to have to cough up the money if you want to upgrade ports, if that's the method by which you do it. Trade ministries that tend not to look at that, but rather short-term in terms of how do you link up and climb the value chain, but actually do not follow the whole chain of the transport from factory to destination. So from my point of view, in order to have a sustainability perspective, you're going to have an integral approach between sustainability and resilience. And because global value chains, and to some extent the transport sector, are basically multiplier effects of climate change, in the sense that if you have a disruption, the disruption will spread to the whole blood system. So while you may have natural catastrophes that in the freight sector they can avoid, if you start clogging up things which are more arteries, more central parts of your body, blood system, you're really creating a huge problem for economic development, and this is a huge disruption to trade. So the way we see it is that in our view, it is going to have to be much more holistic perspective, meaning involving far more ministries than the transport ministries in order to understand the full planning cycle for ports and for the transport sector in general. We certainly believe that this is going to be much more international cooperation. I had the pleasure of sitting down with the Minister of Commerce, who just happened during Ebola to be almost the Minister of Transportation, because it was all about getting the medication in. It was all about getting the fuels in. You couldn't simply have these in this horrible health situation where you could not put up the hospitals to treat the ill unless you had a functioning transport system that could bring it in. So these are all interconnected, and we need to make sure that developing countries that usually lack resources for this are fully integrated, because the manner in which they integrate in global value chains and thereby trade is the method by which they will bring themselves out of poverty. And then finally, just to repeat my point, we find that the climate mitigation or climate adaptation strategies are not yet fully integrated into the planning cycle for ports or for the transport system as a whole. There's a lot of debate on the carbon footprint of the sector, but we think that this other aspect, which relate to sustainability, is insufficiently addressed and insufficiently looked at.
Yes, certainly. If you would, very briefly, because I do want
I'd like to just really briefly respond to the last three, actually, or maybe all of the comments, because indeed this is becoming a global issue, and indeed things are moving, especially in the terms of connectivity. Europe responded to these challenges with so-called 10T network, 9 major corridors that are connecting all parts of Europe into one single European transport area. And but it's not only Europe. Just a couple of weeks ago, we signed an extension of the 10T network for Western Balkans, which is also very promising, and bringing all Balkan countries as integrating them as part of the overall European transport area. The other very encouraging move is now by our Asian colleagues, and we are just in a dialogue of signing some more binding agreements regarding the Silk Road, which will connect Asia with Europe via railway systems, which is really an exciting project, and especially the way how railways are developing, and the new record that has been just broken with 603 kilometers per hour is giving a really promising future to this mode to compete with the airline industry and to bring it in some sort of balance. So yes, these are exciting things. We're now hearing about the Cotton Road and Vikings Road. More and more countries are realizing that they have to bundle together, that they have to come together and introduce networks, yeah? Not just point-to-point connectivity, but the mesh networks that are actually offering also the alternative routes in case of accidents and things like that. So of course, we are not responding as quickly as the business might demand, but certainly we are moving in that direction, and the whole global world is becoming really one big network. But there is a lot of opportunity yes, to address, and especially we need to get all the countries on board to share this business perspective of one global system.
Thank you very much. And I would like to come back to you, Minister, for a comment on other issues, if you wish as well, but particularly in regard to holistic planning, which we just heard Mr. Reiter talking about, and perhaps also the question of adaptation. Would you say that your country is taking the approach to adaptation that it needs to have, given the risk of threat?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it depends a lot on each country and its characteristics. For example, we've heard here about multimodality and cooperation. In the case of Chile, which is geographically, it's like an island, because we have a mountain on one side, the sea on the other, a very long desert in the north. You're very isolated, so the options are, I think, very limited. And there, what you have to do is to analyze what are your weak points. You have to identify your weakest point. In the case of Chile, it's definitely, I would say, it's ports. We're a very open economy. If we have a disruption, this, besides obviously local effects of natural disasters or what's going to happen with climate change in the next 50 years, but major disruption to the ports would be lethal to the economy. Therefore, we've recognized this in the last 20 years through public-private partnerships. What we've done is to concession terminals with a commitment to invest in the terminal, particularly in earthquake terminals that are anti-seismic buildings, so that they construction, so that they're not affected by earthquakes. And I think as this is a country-by-country issue, is how much money do you have to spend on redundancy, on preparation for these events. And I think the most important thing there is to identify and give the priorities. What are the priorities? In the case of Chile, it's definitely ports.
Thank you very much. I would like to try to work in a few audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, And we will come to you with a microphone. At least I hope we will. Do I have microphone? Yes, I do. Who would like to pose a question? We're perfectly willing to keep going up here, but if you do have a question, now is the time, and we'd love to hear from you in the audience as well. Please. Okay, I see two in the middle as well. Keep your hands up if you would, and then we can get a second mic to you at the same time. Very good. Thank you.
Hello, Miles Elston from the Department of Transport in the UK. One of the speakers mentioned the issue of pricing resilience when they spoke at the beginning, and I haven't heard too many of the other panel members mention that. It'd be useful to get their thoughts on how we can take that issue forwards.
Who would care to address that? I'll let our panelists think about it for a moment while I take the other question that will bundle a few here. Who had a question in the middle? Please raise your hand. Yes, high up. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, Chris Döpken, International Transport Journal from Switzerland. I was very much interested in the question of Mr. Tans and saying, well, how can we get some progress into the evolution of ports, because you said, you know, with fleets of ships it's easier, but of course with thousands of ports it's harder. You have the regulation side from the governments to say, okay, we close this port, we make the other one bigger, etc. So how can we get, if we are talking of a holistic plan, how can we get, so to say, the world to become smaller in the sense that, to say, the connection of the ports can be improved and then maybe the number of ports reduced?
Thank you very much.
That is actually a big question, because I stay awake thinking about it all the time. No, seriously, I mean, that to me is one of the most important questions for our next couple of decades, because we saw in the scenarios yesterday, I wasn't here, but I read them this morning, about increased trade over the next 30 years and, you know, what trade has to do, what logistics sectors have to do in order to support that trade. And I think fundamentally, and to the Minister of Chile, it's really location by location. I think the authorities need to take the lead, put some effort into assessing the future demands that you want to serve. Is it just import-export, or does it include transshipment? What is the nature of the business that your ports would serve in the foreseeable future? How does that interact with the city? And the CEO of Michelin talked about the difficulty in last-mile deliveries. Well, freight logistic management is exactly that. We want to make sure that you want to be efficient, but not get in the way of people's mobility. And as a result, in many places, it requires a rewrite of the master plan of how to handle freight holistic planning versus urban planning for people and communities. I can name a couple of examples just to highlight, like in Thailand. Previously, the main port was in Bangkok. They've gone to Lam Chabang, but they've created a freight corridor. In India, the freight corridor between Mumbai to Delhi is 1,500 kilometers. We talk about Europe, the potential for rail. I'm excited about that because that helps to increase the efficiency. And of course, we know in the US, to get to the mid-continent, there's a lot of connections on land. So when you take into account all these possibilities, nothing new, not new robotics or technology, but just in terms of really mapping out what you want to serve and how you create a non-interference plan in order to have an efficient freight logistics chain, I think that's a good start. We help governments do that in the places where we operate. Our partners are often sizable companies or governments themselves, and we would go and try to do our best to provide and lend a hand, provide support and lend a hand in mapping our master plan. 20, 30 years, we need to do that.
Would you pass the mic to your right, because I'd like to get Mr. Davies' input on this as well.
I think there's two parts to it. The first part is quite simple. The politicians have to stop propping up small ports, because socially they're seen as economic enablers, but in fact over time they become a disabler to a better system. So if you can get people out of propping up every little port, you'll get some form of consolidation. If you look at the history of ports around most countries, the number of ports has come down dramatically. I know in New Zealand it has come down from 135 to 14 over just over 100 years. So actually as ships get bigger, the ports do disappear if we allow it to take place. Secondly, we need to make sure the ports that we do want to be our hubs get the inland infrastructure that they need, and that means road and rail. It's very easy to talk about it, but actually from a municipality government perspective, that means spending considerable dollars to make sure that freight flows efficiently to where it needs to get to.
Thank you. Joachim Reiter.
Maybe I can be a bit controversial on this question, because I come from a country where if you look at the railway when it was built, you know, the places where they put the stations, you really have to apply a political economy analysis to it and not an economic one. And I think to some extent we're dealing with the same. So we're dealing with vested interest as usual. We're dealing with politicians caving into those vested interests. What you normally have to do, and I've spent many years of my life negotiating with, trying to get customs officials to be cutting down red tape and be more efficient. And it was a rather difficult start, but what we did was, in order to tackle that political economy, you really have to start doing cost-benefit analysis. You have to start calculating the societal cost of an inefficient and of a system based on vested interest. It's only when you have these hard facts of what it costs that you can then balance it with whatever jobs you will lose in a particular sensitive region of a country by closing down the port. Because, I mean, every time you close something down, it does have an effect, and politicians need to have answers of what they're going to do with these people, as well as what are the pluses for the society as a whole by doing it. So I think, you know, as in the case of my organization, we actually do impact assessments, so we try to help politicians to have more, if you want, a more objective analysis of the pluses and minuses of decisions that they can take, evidence-based policy making basically, so as to allow them to rise above vested interest and lobby. But it is very difficult, and we have to acknowledge that ports are similar to the way that railways are, with awkward stops along the way, and it's difficult now to close them down. Even if you have a fast train, you have to stop, you know, far too many times if you go from Stockholm to Malmö. It makes no sense. But this is the same thing with ports, basically. It's very difficult once you lock yourself in, and then you need all the ammunition as a politician to get out of it.
So again, a call for evidence-based policy-making and decision-making, but in this case, not only based on assessment of vulnerabilities and risks, but also, of course, on costs and benefits, including political ones. Yes, please. I'd like to come to the Commissioner also to address the first question, I think.
Well, I would like to respond to the colleague here who raised the pricing issue, and I think we paved the way to this topic anyway. But maybe from the perspective of, like me, as a commissioner, what I see in Europe, in most of the cases, this is related to also the ownership of the infrastructure and the way how we relate to the transport infrastructure. It is still sort of a legacy that we are dragging along, that this is very closely tied to some sort of national asset. It's a national pride. It is really kind of emotional, and it's kind of hard to get out of this. It's just something that countries have been nurturing for years and years and years, and all of a sudden now, of course, EU is very slowly but surely pushing towards open markets, but towards open competition in all transport modes, and it's not always smooth and really easy way to do it, but I think this is the only way to do it. We have to create the single European transport area, and an important thing is that we push, and we are pushing more and more towards performance-based regulation, and of course to liberalization and full competitiveness. The biggest resistance that we see is in railway. We have lots of challenges with the fourth railway package that is actually paving the way for railways. But as I said, it's a cultural, it's a national issue, and little by little, I'm sure we're going to build the needed level of confidence to move a bit more boldly into this direction. But the first compromise that we are doing in this direction, and hopefully will serve the businesses and the the passengers well in this direction, is that we at least insist on performance-based characteristics. So yes, okay, it is still okay to have a single provider, but it has to ensure a certain level of performances that can then, of course, businesses build upon it. But as I said, we all have to do it together. I mean, it is not a single stakeholder that can push forward. I'm inviting you all to not to say this is politicians' challenge. Let's sit together, let's draw together a strategy, and then let's push it from all sides, because it's a mutual effort to do, and it's a big challenge to address, but together I think we can do it.
Could you pass that microphone to Mr. Skassel, who also had a comment?
Pricing resilience, are we on to now? I think the short answer to the question is I am amazed how resilient pricing is in our industry. It's an industry that's built on supply and demand. It follows the economic cycles in terms of profitability of the hotels and the airlines and the car rental businesses. And it's been built on ferocious pricing competition, extraordinary yield management, currency management systems, which all of these suppliers have put in place over the years. And that's been made even more transparent from a pricing perspective by internet online bookings. So it's very transparent, very ferocious. The pricing goes up and down. Where we've got to be very careful, and the UK is actually not a good example of this, is that if you look at airline pricing, the core price that the airline receives will go up and down with that supply and demand and currency fluctuations. But there's a bunch of other things now that go into the total price of the ticket. And something like air passenger duty in the UK is not a good tax. And I say it's not a good tax because it started as an environmental tax, but over the years just was sidelined into becoming part of the remuneration scheme for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it takes us back to a question we were talking about earlier. Would people pay more if the taxation on the price of a ticket was actually going back into construction of terminals or environmental issues? And if the answer was yes, then maybe the consumer would pay. So the danger for us in terms of this pricing resilience and overall demand is that governments actually leap too much on this bandwagon of taxation where it cannot be fully justified as paying for infrastructure or paying for environmental improvement.
Thank you very much.
Just a very brief comment. One thing that people don't always appreciate is that airlines and shipping lines, long-term profitability is very, very low. There isn't a lot of margin in there. And in fact, I think they race to the bottom with each other.
Just one sentence. EU is now moving towards this. We're just at the beginning of the concept polluter pays and user pays principles, and we hope to build up this consciousness that actually the infrastructure has to be paid by the users and not one of those governmental tax investments. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that we will leave it there in view of the time, and I would just like to say thank you very, very much to all of you for this very thought-provoking and very interesting interaction. To get this view of both sectors and some of the parallels, but also contrasts, has been very, very interesting indeed. So can we have a warm round of applause for all of our panelists? And many thanks to you in the audience as well for your attention and for your contributions. And I look forward to seeing everybody, hopefully this evening, at the gala dinner in the Glass Hall. And I wish you a very productive afternoon until then. So many thanks for your attention. See you later.